Every human being carries two worlds inside them. One is gentle, compassionate, full of softness and empathy. It is the part of us that reaches out, that cares, that loves without reason. The other world is darker, quieter, hidden beneath layers of politeness and self-control. Most people never meet this second world until something awakens it, and nothing awakens it faster than power. Power is not simply authority. It is an invitation for the hidden parts of the human soul to step forward. It whispers, "Now you are in charge. Now you can shape what happens. Now you can decide the fate of others." And when power whispers, something inside us listens. Something that was asleep opens its eyes. Something that was silent finds a voice. No one is born cruel. No one enters this world with the desire to harm, dominate, or suppress. Children are born with open hearts, not hardened ones. But as life unfolds, as wounds form, as insecurities grow, as fear deepens, something begins to shift. And when power arrives before emotional maturity, before self-control, before empathy has matured, the human heart begins to reshuffle its priorities. This is why history's cruelest leaders were not born with blood on their hands. They were born crying, just like every child. They played, they dreamed, they hoped. But somewhere along the way, the world shaped them, wounded them, and power exposed the most fragile parts of their identity. People imagine cruelty as something dramatic, loud, or explosive. But the truth is the opposite. Cruelty doesn't arrive with thunder. It begins with subtle entitlement. Tiny thoughts, small shifts, quiet moments where a person realizes, "I can get away with this," or "No one will stop me," or "My will matters more than theirs." Cruelty doesn't start with violence. It starts with permission. Permission granted by power. Imagine a candle. Its flame is small, delicate. Now imagine wind pushing against it. At first the flame flickers, but doesn't die. Instead it grows stronger, stretches taller, burns hotter. That is what power does to the human ego. It ignites it. It feeds it. It convinces it that it was meant to rise higher and shine brighter than all others. At first, this hunger for elevation feels harmless. After all, everyone wants to feel respected. Everyone wants to feel seen. Everyone wants to belong. But power adds something else. The sense that respect is not enough. That admiration must be demanded. That boundaries are annoyances. That others exist to obey. People shift without even noticing the transformation. It begins in the eyes. The way they look at others changes. Then in the voice, the tone becomes sharper, heavier. Then in the decisions, choices become less about fairness and more about keeping control. And what makes this even more tragic is that most people who eventually become cruel never saw the transformation happening. They believed they were still good, still moral, still the hero of their story. Power does not announce its corruption. It changes a person quietly. It changes a person quietly, takes their empathy in small pieces. It steals their kindness in fractions. And slowly, the heart becomes numb. This numbness is the birthplace of cruelty. Not hatred, not anger, numbness. The inability to feel the suffering of others, the loss of emotional connection to those below you. When power begins to erase empathy, everything else follows. Words become harsher, decisions become colder, actions become more reckless. And the person who once promised themselves they would never harm anyone begins to do the very things they once despised. And so the story begins. The story of how good hearts fracture, how ordinary souls twist, how gentle people become something they once feared. Not because they were born cruel, but because power arrived before their conscience was strong enough to hold it. This is the quiet beginning of the darkness that grows when someone finally hears power whisper, "You can do anything," and they believe it. Why do good people become cruel when given power? The answer isn't found in simple good or evil, but in the intricate wiring of the human brain. In the silent currents of emotion and instinct that guide our behavior. To truly understand cruelty, we have to look at how power literally rewires the mind. The first major shift happens deep inside the brain's empathy circuits. Neuroscientists have discovered something astonishing when people gain power. The regions responsible for compassion and understanding others' emotions become less active. This doesn't mean powerful people consciously choose to be cold. It means they literally feel less. They start to lose their innate ability to recognize the emotional weight of their actions. It's like losing your sense of touch. Imagine trying to handle something delicate with numb fingers. That's why power can make people so insensitive. They're navigating the world with a much duller emotional signal. The second psychological shift is the collapse of consequence awareness. For most of us, kindness is reinforced by a healthy fear of consequences, social judgment, punishment, or even just guilt. But when someone gains significant power, that fear starts to fade. They begin to believe, consciously or not, that the rules just don't apply to them anymore. Their status becomes a shield. And when the fear of consequences disappears, the conscience grows weaker. This was proven dramatically in the infamous Stanford prison experiment. 24. Ordinary. Psychologically stable college students were randomly assigned roles as guards or prisoners. The guards were given simple uniforms, batons, and a sense of authority. Within just 2 days, these normal young men transformed into aggressive figures who psychologically humiliated and abused the prisoners. These weren't cruel individuals by nature. They were transformed by the illusion of power. It wasn't about evil it was about human nature, raw and unfiltered. Then there's the famous Milgram experiment, which revealed our shocking capacity to obey harmful authority. Participants were instructed to deliver what they believed were real, increasingly painful electric shocks to another person. A staggering 65% of them delivered what they thought were lethal shocks, simply because a person in a lab coat told them to. These were regular citizens, not violent sociopaths. They showed how power, even when it's borrowed or just symbolic, can weaken our empathy and amplify our obedience to authority. Power also acts like a key. It's unlocking what psychologists call the dark triad of personality traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Most people have small dormant seeds of these traits within them. But when you give someone power, these seeds get watered. Narcissism whispers, "I am superior." Machiavellianism argues, "The end justifies the means." Psychopathy dismisses, "Their pain does not matter." These thoughts weren't created by power. They were already there, waiting to be activated. Another deeply unsettling phenomenon is dehumanization. Power can make people see others as less than human. A leader might start referring to people as numbers, statistics, or populations. A manager might see their team as resources. A soldier is trained to see enemies as targets. Once you stop seeing another person as a complete, complex human being, anything becomes possible. Harshness becomes normal. Cruelty becomes justified. Harm becomes rational. Power also creates a profound psychological distance. The powerful often live in a separate world, insulated from the consequences of their decisions. They're in the penthouse, while the effects of their choices are felt on the ground floor. When you don't share the struggles of others, you eventually stop understanding them. This distance can widen until the powerful no longer see real people. They see only roles, functions, or obstacles in their path. And then, of course, there is ego. The moment power enters a person's life, the ego awakens like a sleeping giant. It starts to convince them that they deserve more, that they're more intelligent, that their decisions are always the right ones. Ego is the death of humility. And when humility dies, cruelty becomes frighteningly easy. It's a tragic but simple equation. Less empathy, plus less accountability, plus more ego, plus more distance, equals cruelty. But perhaps the most frightening part of all is this: power changes a person's core identity. They start to genuinely believe they are more important than others. Their self-worth becomes tied to their ability to dominate and control. They begin to define themselves by their power. This self-image can become powerfully addictive. Power becomes a drug. The more they taste it, the more they crave. And when someone fears losing that power, they become capable of devastating cruelty to protect it. The mind reshapes itself to preserve its status. It justifies any action, rewrites narratives, convinces the person that everything they do is necessary, reasonable, even moral. Power blinds. It blinds people by convincing them that they are still good, even as they commit great harm. Cruelty is rarely a sudden explosion. It's a slow, quiet psychological transformation, a gradual erosion of empathy, a steady decay of humility and conscience. Good people don't suddenly become cruel because they discover a hidden joy in hurting others. They become cruel because power has quietly and methodically numbed the very parts of their soul that once made them human. History is a graveyard of human transformation, proof that cruelty is not born, it is shaped. The leaders we now remember as monsters were once ordinary people with ordinary lives. But when they gained power, something shifted, and the world changed forever. Adolf Hitler was once a rejected artist. He lived a quiet life, dreaming of being a painter, felt humiliated, ignored, unseen. When he entered politics, power became the medicine for his wounded ego. But that medicine turned toxic. It fed his insecurities until they grew into ideological hatred. As his power expanded, his empathy collapsed. He stopped seeing human beings and started seeing categories Aryans, enemies, parasites. The man who once painted landscapes ordered mass extermination. His cruelty was not born. It was constructed by power, ego, and a deep-seated fear of losing control. Joseph Stalin's early life was filled with trauma. Born into poverty, abused by his father, and bullied by his peers, he carried wounds that never truly healed. When he finally reached a position of authority in the Soviet Union, his fear of vulnerability turned into aggression. Stalin became paranoid, convinced that everyone was plotting against him. His insecurity, mixed with absolute power, resulted in purges, gulags, and the deaths of millions. Deep down, Stalin was terrified of losing his grip on power, and fear is one of the most dangerous fuels for cruelty. Mao Zedong began as a passionate intellectual, someone who genuinely wanted to free China from what he saw as oppression. But as he gained more and more power, he distanced himself from the very people he claimed to be fighting for. He started to see citizens as pawns, mere tools for his grand vision. When mistakes were made, when famine struck, when people died by the millions, Mao didn't adjust his course. Now power had insulated him from the consequences of his actions. He convinced himself that all this suffering was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. This is how a noble vision can curdle into madness when power strips away empathy. Then there's Pol Pot. He was once a quiet, educated man who studied in Paris, but he returned to Cambodia with radical ideas and eventually absolute authority. He believed society needed a complete and total purification. Villagers, intellectuals, children, no one was spared in his quest for an agrarian utopia. His cruelty didn't come from a heart that was inherently evil, but from an ideological arrogance that was amplified by unchecked power. He was so certain he was right that any amount of brutality became justifiable. King Leopold II of Belgium is another chilling example. To the world, he was a refined European monarch. But in the Congo, where he held absolute personal control, his true nature emerged. He extracted resources through forced labor, brutal punishment, and widespread terror. Millions died under his rule. The very same man who attended operas and wrote letters about morality was responsible for the mutilation of workers who failed. To meet their rubber quotas, power didn't change him. It revealed the darkest version of who he was all along. Even in more recent times, we've seen leaders follow this same tragic pattern. Saddam Hussein grew up in a violent environment. When he finally reached power, he mirrored that violence on a national scale. Muammar Gaddafi began as a revolutionary with anti-imperialist ideals, but over time he became a paranoid dictator. Detached from reality, Bashar al-Assad was a soft-spoken ophthalmologist who never even intended to lead, but when power was handed to him. The quiet doctor became a ruthless ruler, presiding over a devastating civil war. History shows us the same pattern, again and again. A wounded childhood, a fragile ego, a growing ambition, rise to power, collapse of empathy. A justification of cruelty, a legacy written in blood. Power does not simply expose a person's character, it exposes their wounds, their fears, their insecurities. Their desperate hunger for validation, their all-consuming need for control. The most feared figures in history were not created by hatred alone. They were forged in the crucible of personal trauma, combined with unlimited power, the most dangerous psychological cocktail ever discovered. And yet, history is also filled with those who resisted the corruption of power. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, who endured 27 years in prison without letting bitterness shape his soul. Leaders like Abraham Lincoln, who carried the immense weight of a civil war without ever surrendering his empathy for all sides. Leaders like Abdul Sattar Eddy, the Pakistani philanthropist, who held immense moral authority but never sought political control, dedicating his life to serving the poor. Their greatness was not born of power, but of humility. They remained human because they never forgot their own humanity or the humanity of others. History teaches us a crucial lesson. Power does not always turn good people cruel. But when it does, the world bleeds. Cruelty isn't just a story from the past. It's not confined to history books or black and white photographs of distant tyrants. It lives right here, right now. It breathes in our governments, our corporations, our schools, and even our families. Anywhere you find power, you find the potential for cruelty. And our modern world, with its unique pressures and technologies, has found new and insidious ways to amplify this ancient danger. You might think that only great absolute power corrupts, but that's a comforting lie we tell ourselves. The truth is, even a little bit of power can be just as poisonous. Give someone a clipboard and the authority to supervise students in a hallway. Some of them will inevitably use that tiny bit of power to humiliate. Give someone the title of manager and some will resort to bullying their employees to feel important. Give someone a uniform and a fraction of them will abuse the very people they swore to protect. Give someone control over a child and some will choose to parent with fear instead of guidance. Power, even in small doses, has a way of peeling back the layers and revealing the unexamined, darker parts of the human psyche. And then there's technology. Technology has supercharged this dynamic in ways we're only beginning to understand. Social media, for instance, grants people a kind of invisible power. Shielded by anonymity, people say things they would never, ever say to someone's face. The screen creates distance, and that distance is a slow poison for empathy. A single tweet, typed out in a moment of anger or arrogance, can shatter a person's reputation built over a lifetime. A single comment under a photo can crush someone's confidence for years. People on the internet aren't necessarily more evil. They just feel powerful, untouchable, hidden behind a glowing screen. 8. It's a digital mob mentality where the consequences feel unreal. Let's look at our workplaces. Corporate power often creates a culture of silent cruelty. It's not always overt aggression. It's the constant, gnawing fear. Employees fear losing their jobs if they speak up. Managers fear losing their status if their team doesn't hit impossible targets. Executives fear losing profits and shareholder trust. This fear is like a current that flows downward, and as it descends, it often transforms into harshness. People stop seeing their colleagues as human beings with families, hopes, and anxieties. They start seeing them as performance metrics, as numbers on a spreadsheet. Entire company cultures can become emotionally barren, driven by relentless pressure instead of human compassion. The water cooler conversations become whispers, and genuine connection is replaced by strategic networking. This pattern starts early in our schools. Teachers with unchecked authority can sometimes humiliate students, using public shame as a tool for control. And among the students themselves, a brutal social hierarchy emerges. Those with more social power, the popular kids, the athletes often bully those perceived as being below them. Teenagers get their first intoxicating taste of dominance. It's a small taste of control, but it acts as a rehearsal for the cruelties of the adult world. They learn early that putting someone else down can make you feel higher. And of course, there's political power, which today feels more dangerous than ever. Modern leaders have mastered the art of psychological control. They use fear, they weaponize misinformation, and they manipulate identity to control entire populations. To maintain their influence, they drive wedges into society, turning neighbor against neighbor. They don't need to build walls of brick and mortar. They build walls of suspicion and hatred in our minds. This form of power doesn't always rely on physical violence. It uses psychological cruelty, the slow burn of humiliation. It's a chilling effect of intimidation, the quiet pain of exclusion. It's about making people feel small and afraid so they become easier to lead. Even in our homes, the smallest unit of society, these power dynamics play out and create immense suffering. Parents who themselves grew up feeling powerless can sometimes overcompensate by dominating their own children, crushing their spirit in the name of discipline. Spouses who feel deeply insecure might try to control their partners, monitoring their every move, dictating their friendships. Even siblings use subtle power plays to shape family roles and narratives. The home, which should be a sanctuary, can become a complicated space where love and cruelty coexist in a confusing, painful dance. The cruelty of today is often quieter than the cruelty of history. It doesn't always come with the sound of guns or the clang of prison doors. Sometimes its weapon is silence, the cold shoulder, the unanswered text. Sometimes it's humiliation, a sarcastic comment in a meeting, a dismissive eye roll. Sometimes it's neglect, the failure to see another person's pain. Sometimes it's manipulation, words to make someone doubt their own reality. And sometimes it's just plain, old-fashioned fear. But the psychology behind it all is exactly the same. Power creates distance. Distance kills empathy. And a lack of empathy is the fertile ground where cruelty grows. To make matters worse, our modern society often rewards the very traits that lead to this. We praise confidence, but we often mistake it for arrogance. Praise leadership, but we confuse it with control. Praise strength, but we misinterpret it as a lack of vulnerability or fear. The world seems to encourage the ego, not humility. We celebrate those who rise to the top, often without asking who they stepped on to get there. We celebrate those who accumulate power, not those who use their influence to uplift others. And so, the cycle continues, repeating itself in every generation. The modern world is a living, breathing testament to the idea that power isn't just for politicians or generals in history books. Power exists in every single moment where one human being has influence over another. It's in the interaction between a boss and an employee, a parent and a child, popular influencer and their followers, or even between two friends. And in every one of those moments, the potential for cruelty stands silently in the corner, waiting. It waits to see which version of ourselves we will choose to be, the one that connects or the one that controls. Now we reach the heart of the truth that explains everything. Good people do not become cruel because they are evil. They become cruel because power exposes the unfinished parts of their soul. Power is a mirror that reflects wounds, insecurities, fears, desires, and ego. It magnifies the parts of us we never resolved. A person who lacked love may seek admiration. A person who feared rejection may demand loyalty. A person who felt invisible may enforce obedience. A person who felt weak may crave dominance. Cruelty is often the echo of past pain, amplified by the lack of restraint. But here is the most important truth. Power does not have to corrupt. Power can heal. Power can uplift. Power can rebuild. Power is not inherently evil. Power is energy. It becomes darkness only when guided by ego. But in the hands of the wise, the humble, and the conscious, power becomes light. The people who remain kind despite having power share three qualities: humility, self-awareness, and accountability. Humility keeps the heart soft, reminds the powerful that they too are human, that they too are flawed, that they too can fall. Humility protects the soul from believing it is superior. Self-awareness allows a person to recognize when ego is growing. It allows them to question themselves, to reflect, to admit mistakes. Self-awareness is the antidote to arrogance. Accountability ensures that power never stands alone. When a person is surrounded by people who speak truth, challenge their decisions, and hold them responsible, cruelty has no space to grow. In the end, power does not change a person into someone new. Power reveals who they truly are, who they have been hiding. Some reveal generosity. Some reveal wisdom. Some reveal wounds. Some reveal ego. Some reveal courage. Some reveal cruelty. The question is not whether power will affect a person. Will. The real question is which part of their soul will rise when power whispers, "You can do anything." And this is where humanity is decided. Because the strongest form of power is not domination, it is self-control. The greatest leaders are not those who command armies or rule nations. They're the ones who remain human, even when they could choose not to. Every person who touches power stands at a crossroads. One path leads to darkness and cruelty. The other leads to wisdom and compassion. Power does not choose the path. We do. Subscribe for more in-depth explainers. Thanks for watching. Stay blessed.